60% of our planet has been consumed by the invaders.
For it is he that they fear, not man, or his armies. They fear the mark of the beast.
And we're back, a little later than planned, but now 2020 is here, and while the world goes to hell, we're off to hell ourselves, as Doomguy back to slay, crush, rip and tear, until it is done. This is a return from id Software, and not using the id Tech 6, but using the brand spanking new id Tech 7, with lots of improvements and benefits across the board, which I cover in far more detail in my full analysis of the overall engine improvements, the game itself, and just how excited you need to be. But here, this is all diving into the performance on the review code I was given from Bethesda, which covers both the Xbox One S and the Xbox One X, the top and tail of the console formats. I will be covering the PC versions very soon, and obviously PS4 once my retail copy arrives. But here I can give you a heads up and a first look at just how the game runs, plays and compares across both consoles before it launches this Friday. Strap in and get ready. It's one hell of a ride. So to kick off the comparisons, let's talk about image quality and effects. Both consoles target identical settings. I could not notice any difference between polygon count, LOD, shadow maps, texture detail, alpha effects, geometry. The only thing I did notice was bloom is subtly pared back on the S, but that could be resolution. But certainly the GPU particles look like they're slightly one rung lower on the S than they are on the X. Other than that, we're looking at a parity set across the board. What isn't in parity though is resolution. Now I couldn't find any points of 1080, even though it might target 1920 by 1080. I couldn't get to that level of counting. I could get many points of 1600 by 900, and then in between 1440 by 810 right down to a low of 1280 by 720 in heavy action. Now this may sound worse than it actually is, and largely that's down to the superb TAA, temporal super sampled anti-aliasing, that was present in the previous Doom and is still just as good and sumptuous here. It keeps all of the image clean, stable and free from shimmer, but it does obviously have an effect on the image quality in terms of softness, because those texture details and high frequency details are lost. Moving on to the X, we see a significant improvement on that, and it doesn't target 4K, it does target 3200 by 1800. I'm not counting any points that go to a native 4K. It might, but I didn't count any points. What I did count is drops right down to 2560 by 1440, which again is a decent reduction, and it helps to keep the game's performance as high as possible, which we'll touch on in a moment. In typical id fashion, this means that it scales the resolution horizontally and vertically. Vertically is the first one to go, and then horizontal after that. So you can get counts of 2880 by 1800, and then it can drop right down to that 1440p natively across the board. And that seems to be its lowest point. It may go lower, I don't know. It may even go higher, I just couldn't find any points. So both versions scale from their top to bottom at 64% of the starting point, and they're 4 times higher on the X than it is on the S. So it's a perfect use of that additional GPU power and also CPU power just to keep performance as high as possible. Now visually you can see the comparisons on screen. There is definitely a huge difference between texture filtering, clarity of detail, off into the distance, and slightly less shimmer. Even though that TAA does a superb job even at low resolutions, you can see the difference. Side by side, it's pretty obvious the huge improvement to image quality is beneficial. Once you get stuck into the action, that 4 times reduction of pixels fades away as you start smashing heads. You can see it if you play one straight after the other, or after a while. There are points on the S where it can be a little soft, and again these examples highlight that at probably its worst point by zooming in. But overall the image quality on both machines is superb, and considering the age and the quality and the power inside the S, it is absolutely amazing that the team have managed to get so much out of that little box, and dynamic resolution scaling is the perfect use of GPU power whenever it pops up. So moving into the next section, and that's loading. Thankfully, just like the original Doom 2016, this is a fast loader, and it's very, very close between both machines. That extra CPU bandwidth don't really help much here. Around 2 seconds quicker on the X than it is on the S to load into a game, and once you die, you're talking a couple of seconds to get straight back into the action and seek swift revenge on whomever put you there.
Against all the evil that hell can conjure, all the wickedness that mankind can produce, we will send unto them only you. Rip and tear until it is done.
And the fast loading means you spend all of your time playing this superb first-person shooter. This is Twitch shooting to the extreme, just like the original title. It's all about your skill, your movement, keep moving, keep flanking people, strafing all the time, constantly on the go. And this means that input times are vitally important. Now this looks subtly improved over the original release of Doom 16 on the X, that is, but the times are slightly slower than the times I tested on the PS4, and this is on both the X and the S here. So you're low, and most of the time you're getting around 88.7 milliseconds of input time. At worst, I'm seeing around 100 milliseconds, or 94.9 to be realistic. So it's very, very minor, the variance between the two. So that's only around 6 frames of input time, which is very, very fast. Not the fastest we've ever seen on a first-person shooter, but it is pretty fast. 6 frames per second on a 60Hz title, or 3 frames on a 30Hz title. So there's definitely room for improvement there, but I covered this before a few years ago on the difference between the PS4 and the Xbox One. There is a subtle delay in terms of input times I've noticed on certain titles, and this is definitely one of them. You're hitting around 65 milliseconds on the PS4 on the original title, so I'll be interested to see just how that input time fares on the newer game, but it's still a very fast and responsive title. In fact, you have to get used to that movement on the camera and the strafing, because the sticks are very responsive indeed. But both versions perform impeccably across the board, and sub 100 milliseconds is a very fast time for any title at all, specifically a 60 FPS Twitch-based shooter like Doom, so you'll have no concerns there at all. And because the dead zone is set almost to nothing on both sticks, you do have to get used to that, but I recommend you don't touch it from the menu. It might feel quite responsive if you're not used to this kind of game, but leave it as it is, because once you get your muscle memory, it plays so much better and more responsive when you play at that level, and that means it's a really smooth title to play. And that leaves us with the final section, and that is frame rate performance. All of the improvements on the title, the tweaking, and Billy Khan has been talking about this a lot, one of the lead developers on the game itself, the GPU programmer, so he's possibly the guy that's driven this game more than Thiago Souza, I would imagine. He has been keen on stressing how optimised this game is, and he was not lying. This is without doubt one of the most optimised titles of this console generation, bar none. It literally swamps the screen at all times. Characters, geometry, particle effects, alpha transparencies, GPU accelerated particles, deformation, completely dismembering objects and enemies. The animation system from both your reload, your characters, the other characters, the interaction. It's even got AI of them fighting each other and combating each other, and obviously working out when they run away from you. The hesitance and the literally the foreboding atmosphere that it gives you when you come in feeling like a complete badass, because enemies sometimes get scared and run away from you. It's just, there's so much going on. There's collision, there's physics, there's geometry, collision and physics. There's so much in the title that I'll cover much more in my full analysis, and yet it's doing all this at a lock solid most of the time. As you can see, 60 FPS, 16 milliseconds on an Xbox One S. The performance is impeccable. There are some minor points which are identical on both the S and the X, which you can see an example of on screen here, which I could find, where it looks like a GPU culling issue in terms of the view frustum, and then it's not culling triangles that are being occluded by objects. If you move slightly forward or back, it starts culling them, so I'm pretty sure the issue here, where it can drop down to pretty much 30 FPS if you just stand and strafe the camera left and right. Move 2 foot forward, it completely goes away. It's not really changing any load to the GPU, so these kind of bugs are typical. You can sometimes get it here, and you can sometimes get it when you're jumping into objects trying to climb up. If you're too close, it can again judder a little bit as you get in there, and you get occasional spikes when you're entering new sections as the enemies spawned in or instantiated into memory, so that can cause a little spike. Again, it's worse on the S than it is on the X. In fact, I don't think I spotted it on the X, other than a 33 millisecond where it can go to like 80 milliseconds on the S. Other than that, it's pretty much a lock solid title. The X is better than the S, in fact. The S is much better than the original Doom 2016. It performs far more consistently. It doesn't drop any lower than 56 FPS, which I think is exactly the same as we saw on the X as well. Aside that, obviously, error I've just shown you, which I've taken out of the calculation because it's not really fair to calculate that. It's a one-off little bug. Aside those, though, both versions perform perfectly almost, and you won't really feel some of the dips that I'm showing you here unless you're very, very, very sensitive to it. I doubt anyone will really feel the difference between both versions. And obviously you can see the examples and the overall statistics on the screen if you are so inclined to jump down to those, but an average of 59.7 on the S and an average of 59.9 something on the X means you haven't really got a huge amount to be concerned about. And most importantly, the 95th percentile on the S is 16.67 milliseconds, and the 99th percentile on the X is also 16.6 milliseconds, which means that is the target you would expect and hope for across the board, and it works perfectly. There are no concerns here whatsoever on the performance, but just in case you don't believe me, you can enjoy a few more moments of action from the X version. You've already seen the S, and hopefully you can jump over and look at my full analysis of the title id Tech 7 and just what it delivers across the board, and that superb inclusion, only at $4.99 if you don't buy the Extreme Pack here, of Doom 64 with a brand new chapter and quite a lot of options wrapped up inside that game, which really brings a game that was very rare and I covered way back a couple of years ago with my Doom retrospective across all the ports and versions. So if you are interested, please check that video out for a look back at it, and also just how this new version performs here that launches alongside this, and if you buy the full pack you get it wrapped up. But $4.99, hey, it's well worth tucking into a title that I feel is the perfect in-between of Doom and Quake. Anyway, I hope you guys and girls enjoyed this. If you did, like, subscribe, share, as those things really help and I will be eternally grateful. And obviously it means I get review code much earlier, which means I can get this information to you sooner and actually have like 2-3 days to cover this title before it launches, which is really refreshing. So I'd like to thank Bethesda for giving me the chance to cover what is another piece of Doom magic, and it is an absolute joy to play. Hell hath no fury like a slayer man scorned. I'll catch you on the next one.